It's my great pleasure to introduce Kara Rooney, a Brooklyn-based artist and critic working in performance, sculpture, and new media installation. Kara's work has been exhibited in group and solo shows at Air Gallery in New York, Brian Morris Gallery, also here in New York, the Chelsea Art Museum, Driscoll Babcock Gallery here in New York, the International Women's Museum in California, the Jersey City Museum, the Montclair Art Museum in New Jersey, the Para Museum in Istanbul, and many other venues. Kara's managing editor at the Brooklyn Rail, and her writing has appeared in Art in America, Hyperallergic, Gag, Meaning, and Perform Alive, as well as with the collaborative writing group Open Dialogue. Kara has done residencies at the Mass Art Artist in Residence program at Bennington College in 2002, Lower East Side Print Shop in 2003, La Quiñonera in Mexico City just this past summer? March. And is currently in residence at the Sharp Valenta Studio program in Brooklyn. She received a BA in Studio Art from Bates College up in Maine in 2001 and an MFA in Art Criticism and Writing from SVA in 2009. She's also a faculty member right here at SVA in Visual and Critical Studies and Art History, and here in our department, where she teaches our thesis workshop, but she also teaches art history and aesthetics courses at the undergraduate level. Please join me in welcoming Kara Rooney.
Way to date me, Mark, with all of those those early residencies. Can everybody hear me? No. How's this? Better. Okay. Okay. I'm going to have to snuggle into this microphone, I guess. So I'm just going to dive in. This talk is a little bit different than the talks I usually give. I felt like this was a good opportunity to experiment with some new forms. So we're just going to see how that goes. I'm a visual artist, but also a writer. This means that I have a particular and at times tumultuous relationship with words. Poetry, prose, lyricism, and rhythm, these are all factors I look for in writing, whether it be that of someone else's or of my own. This complicates my relationship to form, for just as I seek to understand the ways in which words are stitched together, the space between reading and cognition, my visual work attempts to wrestle with aspects of the unseen, the non-place or moment prior to recollection. In both instances, I'm working with the ephemeral, the fleetingness of sound as it fades out of existence, and the visual cue beyond that which is visible. For these reasons, I'm always a little bit uncomfortable speaking about my work. To show an image as a direct representation of meaning feels disingenuous, like casting shadows upon the wall. For myself, the only way to truly engage with the object is in real time. So instead of walking you chronologically through a series of physical trials and errors, I've decided to frame the following instead within a series of narrative excerpts. What follows is not sequential, but oscillates between the present and the past, finished work and experimentation. Some of you might know that I recently returned from Egypt, 3 days ago actually, which, as you might expect, was a serious perspective shift. I hadn't visited the country before, nor did I know what to anticipate going in. I knew about the recent turmoil, its political scandals, and ancient history, its monuments, temples, and archaeological treasures, but I was considerably more interested in learning about the contemporary fabric of the city, its people, how they relate to one another, what modes of expression they use, and how the Arabic language shapes their everyday experience. While sitting in what seemed like an endless deluge of traffic one day, which if you ever go to Cairo, you'll experience firsthand, my friend pointed out a host of graffiti that had been redacted by the government. Along the walls of the interstate, various groups had written scrawling phrases in Arabic speaking out against their government's actions, the vestiges of protests left over from the events of 2011. The text remained there for a number of months until one day it was simply blotted out. Not painted over, mind you, or made to disappear, but visually redacted in black paint, a constant reminder of the fact that dissonant voices would be stamped out. The images I shot from my taxicab window that night were haunting. They struck me as particularly poignant because I've long worked with redaction as a point of entry, questioning ideas such as what does it mean to literally black out speech, not to eradicate it or erase it, but to write over one's thoughts and desires. The layering quality of redaction, of the black mark, became my focus, because in it there's always a history, a potential story waiting to be revealed, similar to the way ancient sites sit and wait to be excavated, for the layers of sand to be removed, buried under time. Between 2010 and 2012, I was consumed by books. The idea, the form, their implication, their extreme vulnerability. Like the redacted graffiti walls of Cairo, these cast resin sculptures ultimately came to represent the residue of communicative and linguistic exchange, both the positive and negative aspects of this type of knowledge formation. I began working with the book form as a meditation on these ideas, later stacking them in an effort to highlight the accumulative effects of transmitted knowledge and decay. The use of the color black was significant, as it alluded to the degenerative effects of such transmission, as well as the increasingly obsolete nature of printed material. Ultimately, these smaller stacks evolved into totemic forms, wherein I cast various printed matter, magazines, newspapers, and books, and wrapped them with rope and twine, signifying the bound nature of speech and relational interaction. The texture of these sculptures was extremely important. I wanted them to be something that you wanted to touch, that you wanted to engage with, something that had presence in opposition to the idea that they were going out of existence. I wanted to give body or three-dimensionality to the concept of redaction. I experimented with this form in a number of ways, adding to, subtracting from, and augmenting the book shape. This piece is titled East Coast, West Coast, and it was intended as a way of working with the increasingly obsolete status of printed matter, and particularly its ability to convey historical inaccuracies. It includes a 19th century children's reader, which falsely recounts the economic and industrial foundations of the US East and West Coasts, pointing to our misguided concept of origins and place. Over the torn pages, I drew a series of marks and glyphs, pointing to these inaccuracies as well as writing over them, in a sense challenging the historical, but from a place of pictorial invention rather than the legible document. Eventually, I began to cast the objects in white, which, to my surprise, shifted the reception of the work significantly. As opposed to the apocryphal tenor of the black books, many viewers read the objects as hopeful, even revelatory. I came to understand the black books as representing the idea of the post-literate, something left after everything else has been said. They appeared as burnt, used, even broken, while the white signified the era before literacy, a time before language had solidified into the narrow confines it now inhabits. The banner that you see here is a word play. It's printed in reflective glass beads as an oppositional reminder of our base human instincts. So if you decode the phrase, it says, "When playing for blood, remember to keep score." It was a way for me to think about the gut response to relations and conversation as opposed to the intellectual one. The relationship between objects, painting, drawing, installation, and performance, and the resulting interconnectivity of meaning was extremely important to my working process at the time. As a result, I often incorporated performances into the work that highlighted the act of physical exertion that went into the making of each piece. The body is registered in the expression of labor, the ritual aspect of repetition, and the potential space afforded by chance. I use performance as a way of experimenting with these ideas in real time, as a way to fuse my intellectual and physical states over a determined period of hours, even minutes. So the performance that you're seeing pictured here is from 2012. It was done at the Lady Volkus Art Center in Kansas City. And the way I was thinking about the performance then was that it really reinforced the polar aspects of accumulation and dispersion that accompany most types of communicative exchange. So over a period of 2 hours, I moved in the sweltering heat between drawing and casting these books in front of a live audience. The drawing itself was a subconscious response to this situation. I hung a blank sheet of paper on the wall with no preconceived idea of how or what it would look like. The result was therefore a direct marker of a specific moment, of a mindset, or of a condition, where all of the pieces were in place for me to fail. Right? And that was really important to how this work would evolve. I needed to make myself vulnerable. I needed to make myself accessible to the audience in order to move the work forward. This is another performative installation that I made around the same time. This piece was a combination of sculptural object and sound, which I'm going to play for you in a moment. The sound piece was a collaboration between myself, the artist Quinn Dukes, and the sound producer Keller McDivitt. So this piece is called That Black Hole of Spoken Language We Call Speech. And it combines sensory deprivation. Essentially, when you look into the box, it's lined with black velvet. So there's nothing that you can see besides this small hole on the bottom that casts a faint glow. It was a way for me to really focus the viewer's attention on sound, right? To immerse them in the experience without actually having them walk into a room. So there's about a 3-minute, 30-second looped audio component that plays with the headphones that are attached to this, which is again about enlisting our flawed methods of communication as fodder for a way of thinking about speed and the transmission of ideas. So I'm going to play that for you now.
Circles and traps, because we walk with apprehension, their sound. And then there was the sensory images, the end. Struggles and traps. As we walk with apprehension, their sound. And then there was the sensory images, the end.
So this piece, titled Monuments of Language, was the culmination of these efforts, right? And it included painting, drawing, sculpture, and video projection in an attempt to bring all of these ideas together under the aegis of a single work. So this is a site-specific piece. It's approximately 20 feet in length. It was made over a period of 6 weeks during a residency back in 2012. More than 120 lines of string connected the piece to a supporting column in the center of the room, forcing the viewer to duck and weave in order to take it in all at once. The video projection was shot in the cloud forest of Puerto Rico and was intended to act as a pause or breath in the face of the more chaotic overall composition. This is a detailed view of the center of the piece. You know, the way I was thinking about it at the time is that in this collision of materials and scale, the work attempted to visually depict the warring desires that govern our social interactions, right? Their complexities and their accumulative effects on identity formation. These former explorations into communicative exchange ultimately led me to work that was more autobiographical in nature, where performance, written text, and a return to poetry versus the theoretical became paramount. For example, I realized that I had to contend with the fact that my definition of language and its functions were very much tied up with my identification as a woman. This piece is called 4 Poems for Pause, and it takes up my interest in poetry as well as a feminist reading of the world. For decades, we've been taught by the post-war capitalist system that the picket fence represents safety and security, this iconic symbol making its way into our collective consciousness as a measure of reproductive liveliness and success. To the contrary, this enclosure, for many women, including myself, has become a site of dialectical opposition. We both long for its promised mythology, while at the same time are cognizant of the fact that what it offers instead is a certain measure of loneliness and even alienation. If we accept feminist scholars such as Silvia Federici's analysis of unwaged housework as the reproductive foundation on which the capitalist economy depends, then we might begin to understand how women were and still are brainwashed into thinking their proper places in the home, accepting in many instances their exclusion from capitalist participation and compliance with the non-monetary sustainment of the program. Historically, this manifested itself as a brand of Stockholm syndrome, where women were forced to either conspire with their enemy or rebel. Thanks to the revolutionary efforts of previous generations, however, these binary choices are no longer the case for many of us, but have been replaced by another crisis of the home, where the domestic sphere is no longer the enemy to escape, but the thing that we can't have. This new crisis is what I was most interested in when I was making this work. And it's the site where the work enters into the contemporary dialogue surrounding the politicized architecture of our lives. With soaring rent, rampant gentrification, and the dissolution of traditional contracts of domestic partnership, the legal and spatial ties that once bound us as women to these spaces has been loosened. Formerly, there was a talk of a poetics of space. To a large degree, this stability has been disrupted. Instead, we're charged with the question of how we associate, codify, and interact with environments outside of our comfort zone. Spaces of non-place, visually and linguistically, emotionally, and intellectually. The text that's routed onto each picket of the fence is a combination of my own personal writing and that of Mexican poet Octavio Paz. It speaks to isolation, disillusion, and revolt. 4 Poems for Pause embodies this idea of the non-place in its mobile and site-specific nature. Originally staged in various urban and rural settings, Its intention was to recreate the roaming and nomadic reality of the contemporary home, while acknowledging the power this cultural symbol still holds over us as the historicized vision of what home should be. By moving this fence from place to place, I hope to provocate a dialogue about our transience, the transience of community, and gendered class economies, reimagining this slippery icon of middle-class oppression into something new, fresh, and viable. Kant says space is not something subjective and real, nor a substance, nor an accident, nor a relation. Instead, it is subjective and ideal, and originates from the mind's nature in accord with a stable law, as a scheme, as it were, for coordinating everything sensed externally. This idea, in concert with the performative action of working with 4 Poems for Pause, ultimately led me to a series of graphite drawings that again employ poetry and physical exertion as a jumping off point for creation. So here you can see the faint reference to the fence structure and the surrounding grasses. The drawings are made over a series of days where I gradually build up the surface of the paper using only graphite powder, water, and one simple bookmaking tool. The text that ends up as part of the work is a result of this meditative action, and it's only determined after the patterned forms have been sufficiently fixed onto the surface. Like 4 Poems for Pause, they're about non-place, or the idea of a subjectively determined space. Again, the poetry is a reference to pause. So this piece here reads, "On a fig leaf, you eat the leftovers of your gods." It was also around this time that I began to work with ceramics. Having traveled extensively throughout India, Asia, and Mexico, I was greatly influenced by the textural qualities of the ancient sites I encountered there. How they held history, right, or retained a sense of the secretive or the mysterious. I could show you thousands of pictures right now, but I decided to limit it to just a few so that you get a sense for what some of the sites I'm talking about look like. So these are some of the monumental tombs in Agra, India. Absolutely stunning architecture, pattern, geometry, repetition. The pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico, which has an incredibly powerful aura about it. Mayan sculpture and glyphs. And the Batu Caves in Malaysia, where there's this strange juxtaposition of gold and scale against these craggy mountains in the background. The ceramic works that I was making afterwards were a way of staging this kind of secretive silence that I experienced in these places. Through working with the kiln firing process, which if any of you have done it, know is extremely temperamental, I became interested in the material aspects of combustion and decay. Working with ceramics was both heartbreaking and thrilling. I had a number of these pieces blow up in the kiln and felt compelled to collect the fragment shards. I couldn't part with them for some reason, right? I couldn't throw them away. So I just had boxes and boxes of these failed works kind of lying around my studio. And it was these initial failures that led to my most recent experiments. So to circle back to Egypt for a moment, while I was visiting Luxor, I was given a tour of Karnak by one of the head Egyptologists there. Karnak is the country's oldest and largest temple dedicated to the god Amun-Re. It's a sacred place of worship in use for over 3,000 years. Khalid, our guide, recounted the story that in 1899, the French archaeologist Legrand decided to flood the temple in the hopes of removing some of the sand that was burying the site. The plan worked, except for the fact that a number of structural columns were toppled and damaged, destroying much of what Legrand had hoped to preserve. You might say the same thing occurs with the attempt to peel away layers of personal history. In fact, the attempt is almost impossible, given that memory recall is such an unstable indicator of actual events. So instead of working with excavation, as I had with the kiln firing process, I began to work with accumulation, burying history, images, facts within a larger framework of sculptural objects, images, and installations. About 2 years ago, this led me to start working with plaster, ceramic, and hydrocal, fragile materials that, like the columns of the Great Temple, would erode over time. Within these forms, I embedded photographic snippets of past experience, an experiment that began as a way of seeing if I could change my own relationship to memory. The result was this installation. It has a very long title called "On Moving Farther Away from Speech, or Hindsight is Never 2020. Through the complex act of cueing, each object and its embedded digital image, along with the sculptural supports that make up the piece, engender a dialogue of ever-shifting fragments. The openly interpretive nature of poetry, along with the attendant metaphors of water, air, and ice, visible in the reflective surfaces of the platforms and photographic snippets, liken this experience to recollection in real time, where the notion of fixed and stable forms is continually disrupted without ever being fully dispersed. Like memory, these works had the ability to float throughout a space. They highlighted the interactive subjectivity that signified memory recall, not from a linguistic perspective, which is often unattainable, but rather from the standpoint of visual semaphore. The pieces are created from a combination of the kiln-fired ceramic failures, plaster, and digital photographs. Each work is unique in and of itself, as well as integral to the larger constructed installation. The forms are made intuitively, and I destroy the molds as soon as they're cast. So also like memory, they can't be recast or repeated, and they're intended to deteriorate over time. Rather than locking one into a specific time and place, the manipulation of the images is meant to free them from their temporal associations. Reflection also calls up other aspects of identity, bringing the viewer into the experience of the work. So the image you see here, I call Tipsy, and it really serves as an anchor point for the rest of the project. So it points to instability, ambiguity, and imbalance, right, both on a personal and a more general level, as well as the theoretical and the intuitive. It's just one of 26 images that recur in various motifs throughout the series. That number loosely corresponds to letters in the alphabet. I'm thinking of these images as stand-ins for what speech could be. So as they float about the space, they call up different associations each time. I also use digital collage as a way of wrestling with these themes of disruption and dislocation. The same way that I cut up words or phrases in earlier series, I do here with the digital collage. The cuts look very different on a formal level, but the action is the same kind of action, right? That sense of collaging, of archiving, tearing down, rebuilding, and of putting things back together. I think of this as performative. Right? So this methodology dissolves the illusory quality of the unit or of the unitary image. It exposes it as a charade, just as the text collages pointed to a different way of thinking about historical memory and authorship. This process also brings me back to the idea of redaction. I utilize the digital cut as both a void and a mirror, attempting to move the viewer through both portals, where they might recognize their own image and false associations, as well as lose themselves in the experience of looking. I call these works reverbs because they're essentially reconstructions of the sculptural in 2 dimensions. Almost like a snake eating its own tail, they're a rearticulation of something that has already happened or that already exists. But then again, reverb also implies a sense of action. Right? You might think of reverberate or vibration of something that never quite sits still. This inability to communicate the temporal concreteness of time and place is for me where the strength of the images lie. They increase our awareness of our less than perfect modes of perception. Rather than objects in and of themselves, I see them as semaphores or stand-ins for speech that's been lost, that's passed out of time, that's in transition, right? Speech that's active and moving from one point to the other. These are some very recent pieces that I'm still experimenting with, so you're seeing them for the first time. What I'm also thinking about as I'm working with these digital collages is a term in the Native American weaving tradition for the Navajo weaver's pathway, and it's something called the spirit line. So the spirit line is a purposefully line woven into the textiles that gives the weaver either a way in or a way out of the composition. It also acts as a way for them to distance themselves from the commercial value of the object, because typically these textiles weren't meant for a Western audience. I'm using the digital cut in the reverb works in a very similar way, where I'm using them to grant access to the image. Right? With the traditional unitary photograph, we falsely enter into a representation of the world that appears like a one-to-one likeness of reality. With the digital cut, you're reminded of the fact that this likeness is an illusion, right? That perspectival space doesn't actually exist, and that this is not an accurate representation of the real. So the digital cut most often registers as a void. It's a blank space that can either be read as an abstract presence layered upon the existing image, or as an absence, such a deep space that you never quite understand where it ends. So it either repels you out of the photograph or compels you to look more closely. And all of these reverbs are printed on aluminum, and then they're joined with the hydrocal material that I'm using for the larger sculptures. So this formal interruption, right, the way that the cut works with the photograph, has the effect of slowing one down, right, of disrupting normal read time. It's that capacity for pause that I feel really gives the work its power. Right? In a culture that's so fast-paced, it can therefore act as a form of resistance of some kind. Together, the interaction of these objects in space is where the conversation really begins, allowing for a rethinking around strategies of interconnectivity and vision. The discrete forms embody different aspects of a complex whole, most succinctly the notion of self. There's a movement of meaning that occurs from one work to the other, emerging out of an interconnected and sustained set of ideas and metaphors. But this movement occurs as a complete experience, not one that's dispersed ad nauseum in the spirit of post-object-oriented discourse that you could argue currently surrounds the evaluation of art in the digital age. These 2 pieces were an installation that I did at Brian Morris Gallery this past summer in connection with the works of Steele Stillman and Andrew Ginzel. So Steele's photograph is on the right, and the three-piece installation is my work, where I started to include these fabric scrims as a way of thinking about the lens or the filter. Weight, weightlessness, and gravity are all significant factors in these larger installations. My fascination with these concepts stems in part from my background. I was professionally trained as a dancer for many years, and as a result, balance has become one of those unconscious things that I've come to realize informs the work and my making process in significant ways. It's something ingrained in the physical presentation of who I am that's simply impossible to escape. In my recent two-woman exhibition with the artist Ruth Hardinger, the fabric scrims acted to choreograph the body in space, determining, albeit very loosely, the trajectory of viewing, object relations, and reception. So that idea of moving around the objects, of how we navigate a space, of how we interact with them, became a really key component for me to think about, and is definitely the direction that I'm still developing the work in now. So if you split the room on a diagonal, you have my work on the left-hand side of the screen and Ruth Hardinger's work on the right-hand side of the frame. The gray of the walls was a nice bonus for this installation. I usually work with atmospheric color as opposed to including color in my actual objects. And since 5 Miles Gallery was founded as a performance space, Hannah Tierney, the director, kept the walls gray because it's impossible to do theatrical lighting in a white cube. And that was definitely a revelatory experience when putting these works on site. You know, we had no idea how this was going to turn out in the end, but I think it really set the tone or mood for the exhibition. So this is the really experimental part of the talk. I often write in my studio, right? So writing's a way for me to work through ideas. It's an extremely frustrating at times, but also can be a very ecstatic process. I can't hide behind words in the same way that I can hide behind objects, right? Words are clear, declaratory, ordered, organized, or at least that's how language is supposed to function. So my writing attempts, the writing that I do in the studio attempts to tackle questions that I have about the practice, right? The unknown. So that liminal space of language as it's translated from speech into text. I see these ideas embedded in the hydrocal shards, right? The vestiges of former works that populate their skin or that hover just below the surface of dust and powder. So I'm going to read you one entry from my writing in the studio. We're just going to see how this goes. There's a society and a need to talk to oneself in the afternoon. Windows Gothic, urban noise, the sound of jackhammers at all hours of the day. Symbolic escape without failure. I sit here and write, read, make things with my hands that only I can touch. Wrestling with my thoughts, actions dominate past regrets. Faded memories, black and white, like snapshots, but unequal. Clumps of prose, nonsense, clutter. What does it mean to say the mind is at rest? Shadow selves account for a large portion of time. Energy, energetic work is the coming of terms. On a different day, maybe, there'd be more forgiveness. Today there is light, but not lightness, dark without darkness. Boredom begets mistakes. I know better. Breathe for a while. Break, but too lazy to leave. Thank you. Any questions?
So I'm wondering about the digital, not sculptures, the digital pieces that you do. How do they feel to you to make? Because everything that you do is very tactile, everything else. So I was just wondering when those came up, because they look tactile as well.
Yeah, I think when I'm working with the digital pieces, can everybody hear me? Okay. When I'm working with the digital pieces, it's actually a very similar working process to the way I'm working with the sculptures. So I'm using the mouse in the same way that I'm using my hands as I'm shaping these works. So I might go through 30 drafts of what these digital cuts look like before I kind of find the one that really resonates with me. They can be, they might look slick or they might look fast, but they can be almost more labor intensive than the sculptural pieces sometimes. Because each time I make a cut, I have to start the process over again. They do have a different kind of surface quality to them, which is why I started to incorporate the hydrocal in connection with the photographs themselves. And I think that brought them closer to the idea of sculpture. And I don't want them to stay photographs. I'm really interested in challenging the understanding that we have of what a photograph can be. So moving them out into 3 dimensions was really important in that respect. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Hi. In the beginning of your talk, you talked about, and I'm sorry I didn't write this down, something about being something feels disingenuous to you, and then you followed that up with, like, casting shadows on the wall is disingenuous. Could you speak to?
Well, it's not that casting shadows on the wall is disingenuous, but shadows they don't have any kind of real physical quality to them. So, with these works, I think there's always something lost in the projection of the image, right? I'm really trying to slow down a traditional read time, which means that you're interacting with these pieces in 3-dimensional space, really trying to take in the textural quality of the works, and that always gets flattened when it's being projected on a screen. So that's what I meant by disingenuous, right? Is that I recognize these as just signifiers of something else. They can't actually embody the livelihood of the objects as I want them to appear. Yeah.
And this is a technical question, the black tables, what's that material?
It's resin.
Resin.
Yeah.
Did you make those, did you cast those yourself? Or?
Yes, which is a very laborious physical process. I mean, you probably noticed that the physical is something that keeps coming up as part of the work. Those resin platforms are made from wood initially, so I'm cutting all of those pieces by hand. They're then sanded down, sealed with a number of layers of paint, and then I'm pouring the resin on top of them. As soon as the resin begins to cure, millions of air bubbles form. And the only way to get them really slick and clean is to either breathe on them, like this exhalation process that you kind of heard in the sound piece, or to use a blowtorch. And wherever I've made work, they're not really down with the blowtorches. So those pieces literally mean I'm on my knees, physically moving around them, breathing, exhaling onto these pieces for about half an hour to 40 minutes in order to get those surfaces really clean and slick. So if you practice yoga, it's kind of like pranayama breathing, right? This is how I think of it. So it becomes this very ritualistic, meditative action. And you're definitely a little lightheaded by the end. Yeah.
And then a final question regarding, you showed us images of, it was sort of in where you were showing the collages, but you said it's new work no one has ever seen.
Right.
I was not sure if it was the photograph that was the work or the thing that you had photographed that was the work that was 3-dimensional.
That's good. That's that slippery area I'm going for. Yeah. So it's about ambiguity, right? I don't want to give it away. Yeah.
You spoke about false associations in terms of like in relation to memory, and I was just kind of wondering what you meant when you said that you need to manipulate it with your own assertion, like the false associations.
Right. So whenever you call up a memory, it changes every time, right? So, and the more frequently you call up a memory, the more likely it is to have changed. So if you look at scientific research, this is kind of the way that it works. So an event that happened 20 years ago that you haven't thought about since then, if all of a sudden you're triggered to think about that, that's probably a more accurate representation of the event than if you thought about something on a daily basis, right? What your parent looked like, for example. So we tend to think of our memories as real, right? We tend to think of them as accurate, when in essence there's really no way for us to know how far from the truth they've slided, right? So when I said I was trying to challenge my own relationship to memory, I felt like the only way to do that was to use a set number of images that I continued to manipulate over and over again as a way of consciously embodying that action of recall, right? And so 2 years later, after working with these images for, I don't know, in how many different iterations, I couldn't tell you where those places were any longer. Like they've just kind of become a blur. They've become something completely different. Does that answer your question? Is that what you meant?
Like I was just kind of confused about I was curious about why you would think false associations would exist in the first place, and why you would feel the need to manipulate it in the first place.
Well, the photograph is only, it's a framed moment in time, right? It never encompasses all of the information that went into that experience. So as a representation of event, it's inherently false. Right? Does that make sense?
Or incomplete, I guess,
Yeah.
rather than false.
Incomplete, but I don't know. I mean, I could argue false as well. How many times have you been asked to smile in front of the
false.
camera?
Yeah,
Right?
so.
And just personal backstory, my mother is a photographer, so this is, these are ideas that I've kind of wrestled with my whole life growing up. How these images become markers of memory and of family history, that's very much tied into the project. Yeah.
My question was also kind of a follow-up on that idea, but more in the sculptural pieces, because they had a similarity to the places you were visiting and that idea of relic and how a relic could represent a big idea, but only a piece of it. And I was wondering if those had a specific place. I know that you came about them because, they exploded in the kiln and they took on a new meaning, but did they come from a specific reference, like a historical or place reference, or inner private lexicon reference, or yeah?
They're really intuitive. I'm working for the molds that I'm using to make them, I'm scavenging materials from, at the time, my studio was in Jersey City, which is in this very industrial area of Jersey City. And so there was so much stuff just kind of laying around that I could use as a way of thinking about form and of, playing with and experimenting. And so for me, they were more like a marker of time and place, but what that time and place was ended up not being very important. What was important for me was that they couldn't be recast again, right? That they couldn't be developed into a series of identical objects. So I moved away from the traditional use of the mold and also the kiln firing process. Working with ceramics seemed too stable. It seemed too archival. And the plaster, which was naturally going to chip and erode over time, was a more accurate way of kind of bringing the ephemeral into the work. Yeah.
Thank you. And I had one other question. The piece about the fences
Mm-hmm.
is really nice, and I was wondering how you showed that. Do you show it as photography, or is it more of just an action that you?
I've showed it in a gallery. I showed it with AIR Gallery as a slightly different iteration, so it actually had video projection on top of it and text as well. I didn't include those images just because it's hard to convey that piece in the gallery setting. It was included in an outdoor sculpture exhibition last year and destroyed. So it doesn't exist any longer. But in a way, it was the natural trajectory of the work, right? There was something really, like I have all of the photographs that the curator took. A number of pieces were destroyed in the show. And I'm still thinking about maybe using them in some way. But
That's fitting for that piece. 'Cause
it's
like
very
a
fitting for
reality
that
shouldn't
piece,
exist or something.
right? It's the serendipitous death that it underwent. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have questions? Yeah, Mark.
I was just curious about what kind of dance you studied or practiced or performed, and whether or not you had any interest now in dance. I mean, I understand why a lot of people stop dancing for, physical reasons, injuries, et cetera. Did you lose interest in dance? Did you consider choreography? Have you thought about working with dance in your own practice at this point?
Yeah, I have. I mean, the simple answer to that is I got injured. And so it was a decision that was partly mine, but that was partly forced upon me as well to stop dancing. I still have a very physical, extracurricular relationship with the body. So it's something that I still do. It's just not something that I was going to pursue professionally any longer. Choreography, I was always interested in, but again, I think just my interest in the visual arts kind of overtook that once this injury happened. Now, and especially that I've had the opportunity to work in larger spaces with these site-specific installations, I'm really interested in working with choreographers and organizations that, as a way of, giving like new life and breath to this work. The thing that I'm trying to get away from the most with these pieces is them sitting in space as a still object. Like I really want to activate them in some way. And so I feel like dance is the natural progression in terms of where this work is going. So I was just invited to do a 3-month residency in Prague in the fall at this place called the Meat Factory, M-E-E-T, not M-E-A-T. And they bring together artists of all different disciplines. So you have choreographers, musicians, theater, poets, writers, and visual artists. And I'm hoping that there I can really experiment more with these forms. I'd love to do it in New York too. It's just a little bit more complicated. Yeah.
Any last question? Can I pass the microphone to you? No, it's fine.
I just have a quick question following on from Mark's question. What type of dance did you do? Practice?
Oh, I did modern and ballet. Yeah. Ballet was required. It wasn't my initial love, but modern was really my love. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Thank you. Ancient sites sit and wait to be excavated, for the layers of sand to be removed, buried under time. Between 2010 and 2012, I was consumed by books. The idea, the form, their implication, their extreme vulnerability. Like the redacted graffiti walls of Cairo, these cast resin sculptures ultimately came to represent the residue of communicative and linguistic exchange, both the positive and negative aspects of this type of knowledge formation. I began working with the book form as a meditation on these ideas, later stacking them in an effort to highlight the accumulative effects of transmitted knowledge and decay. The use of the color black was significant, as it alluded to the degenerative effects of such transmission, as well as the increasingly obsolete nature of printed material. Ultimately, these smaller stacks evolved into totemic forms, wherein I cast various printed matter, magazines, newspapers, and books, and wrap them with rope and twine, signifying the bound nature of speech and relational interaction. The texture of these sculptures was extremely important. I wanted them to be something that you wanted to touch, that you wanted to engage with, something that's in which words are stitched together, the space between reading and cognition. My visual work attempts to wrestle with aspects of the unseen, the non-place or moment prior to recollection. In both instances, I'm working with the ephemeral, the fleetingness of sound as it fades out of existence, and the visual cue beyond that which is visible. For these reasons, I'm always a little bit uncomfortable speaking about my work. To show an image as a direct representation of meaning feels disingenuous, like casting shadows upon the wall. For myself, the only way to truly engage with the object is in real time. So instead of walking you chronologically through a series of physical trials and errors, I've decided to frame the following instead within a series of narrative excerpts. What follows is not sequential, but oscillates between the present and the past, finished work and experimentation. Some of you might know that I recently returned from Egypt, 3 days ago actually, which, as you might expect, was a serious perspective shift. I hadn't visited the country before, nor did I know what to anticipate going in. I knew about the recent turmoil, its political scandals, and ancient history, its monuments, temples, and archaeological treasures, but I was considerably more interested in learning about the contemporary fabric of the city, its people.
In visual and critical studies and art history, and here in our department, where she teaches our thesis workshop, but she also teaches art history and aesthetics courses at the undergraduate level. Please join me in welcoming Kara Rooney.
Way to date me, Mark, with all of those those early residencies. Can everybody hear me? No. How's this? Better. Okay. Okay. I'm going to have to snuggle into this microphone, I guess. So I'm just going to dive in. This talk is a little bit different than the talks I usually give. I felt like this was a good opportunity to experiment with some new forms. So we're just going to see how that goes. I'm a visual artist, but also a writer. This means that I have a particular and at times tumultuous relationship with words. Poetry, prose, lyricism, and rhythm, these are all factors I look for in writing, whether it be that of someone else's or of my own. This complicates my relationship to form, for just as I seek to understand the ways, how they relate to one another, what modes of expression they use, and how the Arabic language shapes their everyday experience. While sitting in what seemed like an endless deluge of traffic one day, which if you ever go to Cairo, you'll experience firsthand, my friend pointed out a host of graffiti that had been redacted by the government. Along the walls of the interstate, various groups had written scrawling phrases in Arabic speaking out against their government's actions, the vestiges of protests left over from the events of 2011. The text remained there for a number of months until one day it was simply blotted out. Not painted over, mind you, or made to disappear, but visually redacted in black paint, a constant reminder of the fact that dissonant voices would be stamped out. The images I shot from my taxicab window that night were haunting. They struck me as particularly poignant because I've long worked with redaction as a point of entry, questioning ideas such as what does it mean to literally black out speech, not to eradicate it or erase it, but to write over one's thoughts and desires. The layering quality of redaction of the black mark became my focus, because in it there's always a history, a potential story waiting to be revealed, similar to the way
It's my great pleasure to introduce Kara Rooney, a Brooklyn-based artist and critic working in performance, sculpture, and new media installation. Kara's work has been exhibited in group and solo shows at Air Gallery in New York, Brian Morris Gallery, also here in New York, the Chelsea Art Museum, Driscoll Babcock Gallery here in New York, the International Women's Museum in California, the Jersey City Museum, the Montclair Art Museum in New Jersey, the Para Museum in Istanbul, and many other venues. Kara's managing editor at the Brooklyn Rail, and her writing has appeared in Art in America, Hyperallergic, Gag, Meaning, and Perform Alive, as well as with the collaborative writing group Open Dialogue. Kara has done residencies at the Mass Art Artist in Residence program at Bennington College in 2002, Lower East Side Print Shop in 2003, La Quiñonera in Mexico City just this past summer? March. And is currently in residence at the Sharp Valenta Studio Program in Brooklyn. She received a BA in Studio Art from Bates College up in Maine in 2001 and an MFA in Art Criticism and Writing from SVA in 2009. She's also a faculty member right here at SVA.